The most important thing China built was not a new currency. It built an exit door. That is the part most people miss when they hear the headline about the yuan being used in a rising share of global trade. They think this is a story about China wanting prestige. They think Beijing wants its money to look more important on a chart. They think this is about flags, speeches, and the old dream of replacing the dollar. That is not the real story. The real story is much colder. The world watched the United States turn the dollar system into a weapon. Then the world began building ways to survive without asking Washington for permission. That is why the number matters. Nearly 30% of China's foreign trade is now being settled in yuan. 15 years ago, that number was basically invisible, less than 1%. A rounding error today, it is large enough to change how governments, banks, oil exporters, and manufacturers think about risk. Not because the dollar is dead, the dollar is not dead. The dollar is still the deepest currency in the world. It still sits at the center of global reserves. It still dominates the most liquid markets. But reserve currencies do not usually die in one dramatic moment. They lose their monopoly through repeated small decisions made by people who no longer want to be trapped. A bank signs on to a new payment system. An oil cargo is settled in yuan. A central bank adds a little more Chinese currency to its reserves. A developing country takes a loan in yuan instead of dollars. A commodity trader decides it does not need to route every transaction through the old dollar machine. One transaction by itself means nothing. Millions of transactions begin to mean everything. For decades, America enjoyed a privilege so large, most Americans stopped noticing it. If the world needs dollars to buy oil, copper, semiconductors, shipping insurance, and industrial equipment, then the world must constantly create demand for dollars. That demand lets America borrow more cheaply than it otherwise could. It lets Washington run deficits that would punish another country much faster. It gives the United States an invisible subsidy from the rest of the world. That privilege did not come from luck alone. It came from architecture. SWIFT became the messaging backbone of global finance. The petrodollar made oil a dollar business. Treasury bonds became the parking lot for the world's surplus savings. American banks sat at the center of global settlement. American regulators could see, pressure, freeze, sanction, and exclude. For a long time, that looked like stability. Then it started to look like vulnerability. The turning point was not one speech in Beijing. It was not one BRICS summit. It was not one central bank white paper. The turning point was the moment governments realized that financial infrastructure could be used like a siege weapon. Iran learned it first. Russia learned it loudly. Every other country watched when Russia was removed from parts of the Western financial system after the Ukraine war began. The message was not limited to Moscow. The message traveled to Riyadh, New Delhi, Brasilia, Jakarta, Pretoria, Abu Dhabi, and Beijing. The message was simple. If your country ever collides with Washington hard enough, your reserves may not be fully yours. Your banks may not be fully connected. Your trade may not be fully safe. Your economy may be one sanctions package away from strangulation. That kind of lesson changes behavior. China understood this earlier than most. It had already begun building CIPS, its cross-border interbank payment system, years before the world took it seriously. At first, many people dismissed it as symbolic. Too small, too technical, too far behind SWIFT. But China was not trying to win a press conference. It was building plumbing. And plumbing matters more than rhetoric. CIPS now has more than 1,000 member institutions across more than 100 countries. Most are in Asia, which makes sense, because Asia is where China's trade gravity is strongest. But the real signal is that European institutions are also connected. These are not countries giving anti-American speeches in public. These are banks quietly preparing optionality in private. That is how serious financial shifts begin. Not with fireworks. With optionality, the first stage is not replacement. The first stage is insurance. Countries do not wake up one morning and abandon the dollar. They create a second route, then they create a third. Then they tell themselves these routes are only for emergencies, then the emergencies become more common, then the emergency route becomes normal business. That is what China is doing. It is not just asking the world to trust the yuan, it is giving the world a usable system for settling trade in Yuan. And then it is creating reasons to use it. Oil is the center of the story for half a century. The United States and Saudi Arabia sat inside an arrangement that gave the dollar one of its strongest foundations. Oil was priced and traded in dollars. If the world needed energy, the world needed dollars. If the world needed dollars, it needed access to the American financial system that created a self-reinforcing loop. But loops can break. China is the world's largest oil importer. Saudi Arabia sells enormous quantities of oil to China. The buyer has leverage. And when the buyer says, we would like to settle some of this trade in our currency, the seller listens, not because the seller wants to overthrow the dollar tomorrow, but because the seller wants flexibility. Saudi Arabia wants American protection. It also wants Chinese demand. Brazil wants access to American markets. It also wants to sell to China without unnecessary dollar friction. Russia wants to escape sanctions. India wants strategic autonomy. The UAE wants to be a financial crossroads, not a financial hostage. That is the pattern. Nobody has to love Beijing for China's system to grow. They only have to fear being too dependent on Washington. This is why the sanctions weapon has a hidden cost. A weapon that works too well teaches everyone else to build armor. The United States proved that it could punish countries by controlling the financial pipes. China's answer was not to complain. It built different pipes. Now look at the wider structure. BRICS has expanded. Trade inside non-Western blocs is increasingly settled in local currencies. Russia has moved large portions of its trade away from the dollar. Brazil and China have formalized direct settlement. Regional institutions in Asia are building habits around non-dollar settlement. The yuan is still small compared with the dollar, but it is growing from a low base at a speed that matters. The danger for America is not that every country suddenly sells all its dollars. That would hurt them too. The danger is more subtle. The danger is that the world stops needing to add dollars at the same pace. That changes everything. If foreign buyers need fewer dollars for trade, they also have less reason to recycle dollars into U.S. treasuries. If treasury demand weakens, yields rise. If yields rise, Washington's debt becomes more expensive. If Washington's debt becomes more expensive, interest costs crowd out other spending. If interest rates stay higher, mortgages, car loans, business loans, and credit card balances become more painful for ordinary Americans. That is how a payment system in Shanghai becomes a mortgage problem in Ohio. That is how an oil settlement in Riyadh becomes a grocery bill problem in Florida. That is how a trade invoice in Sao Paulo becomes a retirement account problem in Arizona. Most people will not connect those dots until the pain arrives. They will hear experts say inflation is sticky. They will hear politicians blame corporations. They will hear central bankers talk about long-term rates. They will hear Wall Street use clean phrases like term premium and foreign demand. But underneath all that language is a simple mechanism. America got used to the world financing its deficits because the world needed the dollar system. China is trying to reduce that need. The digital yuan makes the shift more serious because it attacks friction. Traditional financial change is slow because trade settlement is messy. Banks need correspondent accounts, traders need liquidity, governments need swap lines, compliance departments need procedures. The old system survives partly because it is familiar. The digital yuan is designed to make the alternative less painful. A trader in Southeast Asia, a buyer in the Middle East, or a state company in Africa does not need to become a philosopher of reserve currency history. It only needs a payment rail that works. If a yuan-based system is faster, cheaper, and politically safer for certain transactions, it will be used. Again, this does not kill the dollar tomorrow. It removes the assumption that every important transaction must eventually touch the dollar. That assumption was the empire. This is why Washington's response looks so weak. Tariffs do not solve a plumbing problem. Speeches do not rebuild trust. Threats do not make countries feel safer inside your system. Every time America says, use our system or we will punish you, it confirms the very fear that pushes countries toward the exit. China's strategy is patient because it does not need the dollar to collapse. It only needs the dollar to become less unavoidable. That is enough. A reserve currency does not lose power only when it falls from first place. It loses power when other countries gain credible ways to say no. The pound did not vanish overnight. Britain did not wake up one morning and discover that history had ended. The decline happened through debt, war, lost manufacturing strength, changing trade patterns, and a new financial center that became more useful to the world. By the time everyone admitted the transition had already happened. That is the lesson Americans should study. Now, the yuan does not need to be perfect to weaken the dollar's monopoly. China does not need to be trusted by everyone to become useful to many. CIPS does not need to replace SWIFT everywhere, to give sanction-bearing countries a second road. The digital yuan does not need to dominate every wallet to change settlement among states, banks, and commodity traders. This is not a collapse story. Collapse stories are too easy. This is a replacement of dependence story. The old world said, if you want to trade, clear, borrow, invest, and hold reserves safely, you eventually need the dollar system. The new world China is building says, maybe not always, maybe not for this oil shipment, maybe not for this loan, maybe not for this infrastructure project, maybe not for this bilateral trade deal. And once maybe not becomes normal, the dollar has already lost something essential, not supremacy. Inevitability, that is why the 30% number matters. It is not a trophy, it is a symptom. It tells you that more trade is moving through routes Washington does not fully control. It tells you that American financial power is still enormous, but no longer uncontested. It tells you that the world is not waiting for permission to redesign the system. The real story is not that China has replaced the dollar. The real story is that China has made replacement imaginable. And in global finance, once something becomes imaginable, governments start planning for it, banks start preparing for it, traders start testing it, central banks start hedging for it. Then one day, ordinary people ask why borrowing costs are higher, why inflation does not fall back to the old normal, why the government cannot borrow without consequence the way it used to, and why the dollar in their pocket feels weaker, even though nobody announced the end of an empire. The answer will be that the end did not arrive as an announcement. It arrived as infrastructure, a new payment system, a new settlement layer, a new oil invoice, a new loan contract, a new reserve allocation, 1,000 quiet decisions made by countries that still use the dollar, but no longer want to depend on it completely. That is the part Washington should fear, not the day the world abandons the dollar. The day the world realizes it does not have to.